Am I okay?
Copies, yeah. All right.
Oh, thank you, because I also forgot to get the text. Do we have a copy?
Do you have that copy? Good morning, everyone. It's so good to see you. Welcome to the Dean's Forum at St. John's Cathedral. I'm Richard Lawson, joined by Dr. Amy Erickson. Welcome to those who are in the room, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us via the live stream. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for this chance to gather in this room with Amy, with this incredible story. We thank you for the gift of scholarship, the gift of history and critical thinking, and above all, for the gift of imagination as we wrestle with this story in similar ways that Jacob wrestled with this mysterious figure. Be with us in our own wrestling, enlighten our minds, inspire our souls. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. So it's so good to be back with all of you. It's great to be back with Amy Erickson. Welcome back, Amy. Amy is a full professor at Iliff School of Theology, where she teaches Hebrew scriptures and directs the PhD program. We happen to have a couple of people from the cathedral who are in the PhD program. Tori Moore, who attends church most Sundays, who's an Episcopal priest, and Zane Johnson, who is our sacristan, whom you see almost every Sunday in every burial and every baptism, is in that very PhD program as well. So thanks for taking good care of people that we love.
Yeah.
And let's kind of skip the pleasantries and dive in. The good news, if you were here last week, the good news is for this week we only have one story. In a sense, only one story. But what we're looking at this week is Genesis chapter 32. You should have a copy of it. I gave you a handout with two sides. Don't worry about the back side, the picture. Let's start with the story, and everything else will get a lot clearer. Amy, how would you like to begin? Do you want to walk us through the story, or you want me to dive in on my questions after reading it?
I think you should read it.
Okay, great.
And then we should dive in with your questions, because I can't be trusted to go through a text quickly enough.
Yeah, you
professional
can't,
liability.
It is a professional liability, and then we had two last week, which was on me. Okay, so Genesis 32. This is just a story it's just fascinating.
Yes, it's the best.
It is just fascinating. Okay. So let's just kind of pause for a minute, and I want to make one. Let me give you one opportunity you've already got a critical decision to make right now. Are you going to listen to me read and read along, or are you going to not read and listen to me? And you, by the way, make that decision in church every single Sunday. And if you're used to doing it just one way, say following along, you might try it the other way from time to time, okay? And it just depends on kind of the way your mind works. Some of us really need to follow along, and some don't. The same night, he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans, and you have prevailed." Then Jacob asked, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose up upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. So where I
just want to say, listening to you read that text, it is so weird. It's such a weird story, Anyway, because usually I read it.
Not my voice.
Not your voice.
That was meant to be funny.
Your voice. I got it.
It is so weird. And one of the things I've pointed out a few times down through the years here, not in your presence, but it would be weirder if we were reading it in a grocery store with the microphone that went over the whole grocery store. And what I mean by that is, it's not that weird in church. It's not that weird in a synagogue in a sense. Depending on where you hear stories like this, they make more or less sense. And one of the things that frustrates me is that we live in a world in which there are places where if you're religious or spiritual, you expect to hear things like this. And there are places where you're not supposed to hear things like this. And I always like for those lines to get a lot blurrier.
Yeah. I like that. Blurry lines are definitely my thing.
All right. So place. Tell us about this tributary of the Jordan. Where are we?
Right. I spent a lot of time with maps yesterday trying to answer this question. I'm not great spatially. But so the Jabbok comes down from Amman, Jordan, kind of heading like southeast toward the Jordan, which is running north to south.
Okay.
So it's cutting across the land of Gilead. It's basically cutting it in two. And it's a super steep river. It's got a huge drop, like 1,200 feet or something like that. Yeah. So it's a treacherous crossing. And it's meeting the Jordan, and it tends to get conflated in Jacob's stories with the Jordan.
Yep.
And of course, literarily, crossing the Jordan means all kinds of things. Yeah. So Joshua, of course, takes the whole army of Israelites into the Jordan, and that enacts a transformation in terms of their identity, right?
Yep.
Because, of course, you have them coming out of slavery in Egypt and wandering in the wilderness and crossing the Jordan and becoming Israelites. So lots of identity transformations happening crossing the Jordan. And that crossing the Jordan, of course, evokes the story of crossing the Red Sea. So this is all very much in the background, maybe not even the background, the foreground of these texts. Somebody asked me last week why Hebrew narrative is so spare, so terse. And they asked, is that because partly they didn't have the same kind of conventions around storytelling? They also have a smaller lexicon, right? So not so many words to choose from as we do. But I said, I think also because everybody knows all this background. It doesn't even have to be filled in because they're telling these stories, hearing these stories all the time. So immediately you hear there's a river and you're like, oh, there's going to be a big change taking place in the lives of the characters.
And that's just like what happens to us, say, with families around the holidays.
Yeah.
You can sometimes, I love stories, and you can imagine how much I enjoy repeating them, and if you live with me, and so Catherine will sometimes just say, hey, we know the whole story because we were there. And we actually remember it factually, too. So, but I think sometimes, exactly. I mean, it was a shared story.
Yeah. So she's like, give us the Hebrew Bible version, like the really snappy one, and we'll fill in because we know.
All right. Jacob is traveling south from the high country of Gilead. So we've got your drop off. Esau is heading north to meet him. I don't think we, for the sake of time, need to spend much much time on that. Actually, let's not.
Okay.
But that's a part of what's going on. This is a part of the Jacob-Esau saga. But that interests me less today than this mysterious figure.
Yeah.
Now, I think that the first place to pause, though, before we dive in on the figure, I think two things happen that are profoundly significant. Jacob is finally alone, so all of his wives, all the stuff, all the things. And we certainly could talk about that, but he's finally alone, and it's at night. Mm-hmm. So that's got to be a huge part of what's going on here. The mood is just right. The mood is just right. He's not in the middle of the cathedral at the 10:30 service.
Right.
What would you say about that mood, that placement, and then the darkness? And then we'll talk about the figure.
Well, let me start with a little ancient Near Eastern stuff, because that's kind of my favorite thing in terms of bringing these stories
and one
to
of the
life.
reasons why you're here.
Okay, all right. So I'll do that part, and then we can think a little bit more allegorically about the significance of the night, which is important, right?
Yeah, I know you mean that as a compliment.
I do. Well, so when I think we hear about a man approaching Jacob at night, you're thinking in the context of the ancient Near Eastern world, you can't help but think about night demons. So the Mesopotamian world is full of spirits, angels, benevolent and malevolent. And even though the Hebrew Bible kind of wants to downplay those figures in order to elevate the oneness and the power of the one God, that's still all in the background. So as soon as we hear there's a man, and what struck me about this text as being weird as you read it is like, all of a sudden, here's a man, and he's wrestling Jacob. What the heck? So you're thinking this must be some sort of demon if you're reading in the ancient Near Eastern world. But then, of course, Jacob is also prone to have communications from God in dreams at night. So I think those things are kind of crossing over each other as we hear this detail of night. And, I mean, you can't help but think dark night of the soul, sort of St. John of the Cross thoughts when you hear that Jacob is alone. Here he is, coming from Laban's, having been a striver. My father uses the word pissant. He was a farmer in Illinois, and he always has like the most captivating little phrases. Anyway, Jacob's a bit of a pissant at this point. And there is a way in which he needs to strive with somebody who is as tough as he is. Now, Laban has gotten the better of him prior to this, but he ends up beating Laban. So now this figure, who is maybe kind of a demon, kind of an angel, because we'll talk about that too as we think about who is this. Yeah.
And I'm going to jump ahead and jump back.
Yeah, okay.
So let's keep going with what you're saying on the wrestling. So this is what that Robert Alter says in his footnote. He's translated all the Hebrew scriptures. He's done, I think, some remarkable footnotes. Amy rightly pushed back strongly on one of them last week, which was profoundly helpful. But here's what he says about the image of wrestling. He says it's implicit throughout the Jacob story, in Jacob's grabbing of Esau's heel as he emerges from the womb. So Jacob's a wrestler from breath one. His striving with Esau for birthright and blessing, his rolling away the huge stone from the mouth of the well, his multiple contendings with Laban, and now in this moment, his wrestling with this mysterious figure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, after last week, talking about Abraham, and Abraham's sort of big quality as a servant of God is his obedience in a lot of ways, right?
Yep.
Certainly in the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, what they want you to know is Abraham is supremely loyal to and utterly obedient to his God. Jacob is like the opposite of that. So he embodies these kind of different values that are also running through the Hebrew Bible that are that coalesce around the figure of the trickster. So he's the underdog in Israel's memory, right? And so a trickster has no respect for authority, no interest in like social norms or, manners and all that kind of thing, good graces, because he's a scrapper.
Right.
And so it's kind of interesting that these two ancestors have such completely different personalities and figure into Israel's identity together, almost paradoxically, right?
Yeah, and I certainly, maybe it's due to the fact that I'm from Alabama, but I relate more to Jacob, and I like Jacob better. Thank you for laughing.
Yeah, right.
I think it's Abraham's just clear faith and obedience is just less appealing, I guess. I don't know, but and in part because it's the child thing. But here, that's a great. Do a quick, just very quickly, and I think you're going to like this question. I think there's like a million reasons to read the Hebrew Scriptures, but one is the stories are better. Like we don't get in the New Testament, they're not better. I don't mean that literally.
Oh yeah, they are.
I'm trying to be playful, but
no, they absolutely are.
But you just get more depth and color. Like you don't there's really not. I mean, Peter, maybe you get some complexity there in the ups and downs throughout the Gospels, but we just have so much more material in a Jacob. What would you say about that?
No, I think that's right. Well, and the way that the stories in the Hebrew Bible have accumulated over time means that they are picking up resonances from other stories, they're getting expanded on, they're getting told twice in some instances, right?
Right.
But also, there's a lot of interest in our people. So, you think about the stories you tell with your family. Those are the best stories because they're rooted not only in these particular personalities, but they're rooted in who we are. Right. So the kinds of stories we tell over time, they like highlight different characteristics of the players depending on the moment, depending on the occasion, depending on who's present now and what our issues are. So all that I think is coming into play every time we hear the story of one of the ancestors or one of our heroes. I mean, even Moses, like think about how rich of a character Moses is. Considering he's like, the perfect prophet in Judaism, he's still got such a rough backstory in a lot of ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, let's hone in then on this mysterious figure.
Yeah, right. So, what I did want to say about wrestling, which I think is kind of interesting here.
Take your time. We got plenty of time.
Okay. What do you make of the wrestling before we get to who this is?
I mean, as a lover of allegory.
Allegory is awesome. So, I don't want to get rid of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I make of it is, I don't know. I think wrestling with the divine is standard fare. I think it's just the way it works. I think an authentic faith is almost always a wrestling faith. It doesn't mean that there's not a place for comfort and security and trust, but I think so. There's something that to me feels normal and expected about it, and then I just. And we'll get into this a little bit later. I love the word mood, and I love what it conveys. I do think there are places and times and moods where I think settings and that just open our heart and mind and soul a little more than other settings. And so that's what I'd say.
Yeah. Well, so the Hebrew word for wrestle is avak, and it only appears like 1 or 2 times in the entire Hebrew Bible, which means we don't really know what it means. So I was reading with Rashi, as I often do, who's a 10th century Jewish commentator.
Is he a good guy?
He's a great guy. He is the guy you want to read with. You want him sitting next to you saying, well, here's what I think, and here are the questions that come up for me, right? So Rashi says that he understands this word based on the Aramaic phrase, they became attached. So some people are like, oh, it's about the dust. There's a word play with avak and the word for dust. And so when they wrestle and they kick up dust and everything like that, it's kind of a gritty sort of moment. But more than that, they become attached. And I've heard people who have read this through the lens of disability, hermeneutics, say this is about this encounter that is profoundly physical, right? And that creates an opportunity for both intimacy and risk, or that it's really based in intimacy and risk, this kind of dance. You know, so I mean, I remember being struck by this the first time I saw high school boys wrestling. I'm like, ooh, wow, that's that's a lot of bodily contact. So that's what Rashi is trying to bring out here, is, you know, not only the fact that they're like scrapping around, but they're entwined.
And that's like fascinating for 1,000 reasons. You know, we probably, I mean, I tend to think about the divine as being other and spirit and more ethereal than my physicalness. And to think about, but this story sort of invites a more literal imagining in a good way of the divine presence being something we physically encounter. Is that in there slightly or implicit?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And we'll get to that when we talk about sacred space. And how does the Hebrew Bible construct or understand sacred space. But yeah, it's very physical. It's very material. That's why the Hebrew Bible is so fascinating to me, because it is very this worldly.
Okay.
So you want to talk about who this is?
Yeah. What all do you want to say? Because we don't know, do we? What do we know? What do we know?
Okay, I'll tell you what we know, because it is pretty interesting, right? So initially you get this just a man who's wrestling around. And then, again, kind of a curveball when Jacob says, I'm going to call this place Peniel because I've just seen God face to face. And you're like, wait, what?
Yeah, exactly.
That was God? What's going on with that?
So let's just pause really quickly. That is absolutely in the text. Like there's the mysterious figure, what in the world? Is it a demon? Is it a whatever? And then you get the name and the confidence, I've seen God face to face. It's like that's so fast. It's too fast.
Yeah, right. But whenever a human being, including Abraham, sees a messenger of the Lord, so often it's malach in Hebrew, which sometimes gets translated angel, sometimes messenger, there's this moment of confusion. And you hear this in, right? I'm not so good on the New Testament, but like Mary or Elizabeth, and the angel comes and delivers a message.
She literally says, and it's a cerebral, it's an analytical question. My New Testament professor, dear Good, always pointed that out. It's Mary's mind is wrestling with that angel. How can this be?
Yeah. So
is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, but also the hallmark of meeting basically a manifestation of God. Because that's usually what we come to find out by the end of the story. The three men who were at the Oaks of Mamre when Abraham is at his tent, and they're coming to deliver this birth announcement, right? That Sarah's going to bear a son. They're, treating them as guests, all the good hospitality, and then they realize, wait, hang on a second. These are kind of divine creatures. They've come to deliver a message. So one way to think about, so the surprise is absolutely expected at the end in the context of these stories. But one way to think about it is that these are incarnations of God. There's a scholar, Ben Summer, he's a Jewish scholar, and wrote this book called The Bodies of God, and he thinks about how God's body manifests on earth. One of the ways, especially in older texts, is through human beings. And, we tend to think of, God up there sending sort of quasi-angelic figures. He says, no, these are actually incarnations. And he says Jews have been kind of hesitant to claim that because it sounds a little Jesus-y. And, there is this sort of, well, if it's Christian, it's not ours.
Yeah.
But, so this seems to be like an avatar. Mm-hmm. And the way divine bodies work in the ancient Near Eastern world and in the Hebrew Bible is that if you have this manifestation on earth, it does nothing to diminish the presence of God elsewhere.
Ah, that's huge.
So,
I think that's especially huge for Christians of all stripes. What I hear the invitation in that is we need to allow for multiplicity in God.
Totally.
God can reveal God's self in a variety of ways, even contradictory all over, and we need to kind of get just a lot more imaginative and expansive. Is that a part of the point?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So these divine bodies, they're multiple and they're fluid. Yes. Which is a little different from Greek mythology. So I think we tend to import the sort of popularized Greek mythology sometimes into our understanding of gods. Yeah. Their bodies are bigger and better and stronger than humans, but they can't be in more than one place at one time. Yeah. So, and maybe somebody, who are Greek mythology people? I know there were some here.
Harold's our Greek. Harold is the one that raised the story last week.
All right. So I may be overstating this here, but like when Athena becomes an owl, she's not fully present also on Mount Olympus in the Council of the Gods. She kind of has to take this one form to be on Earth.
I also think, one of the things that makes Greek gods fun is that they're very peccable, they have their love affairs, they have their many illegitimate children, they have quarrels, they get even with people, and I find that really entertaining. And I often wonder, what the spirituality, quote unquote, of the Greeks of that time, who were so smart and so, whose philosophy and culture has so wonderfully influenced our own. Yeah. Did they find spiritual nourishment in these gods, and to what degree did they actually believe in them?
Yeah. Well, so there's so much kind of overlap in conceptions of the gods across the ancient Near East and Greece. There's difference too. But one of the things, of course, that the Hebrew Bible is trying to do is inject a little morality into the divine figure, right? So if the realm of the gods, myth, cosmos, everything, kind of explains why things are chaotic on Earth, your best bet is always to speak to the one God who might favor you or who you might have an in with. And what the Hebrew Bible starts trying to construct is a God who's actually got some moral standing, some moral fortitude, right? Which is different. Yeah.
Just very quickly, that piece, partly why I got so excited, in the back of my mind was on the God doing a variety of things, even somewhat contradictory. Christians have, when it comes to the crucifixion and Good Friday, there's just this laborious, is God, what is God the Father doing as Jesus is on the cross? Right. And then there's sometimes all these real attempts to be like God's will is being done on the cross, so God the Father is sending the Son to the cross. And all, that's not necessarily literal, but we don't need to the Trinity doesn't have to always show up, all three of them simultaneously, is what I'm trying to say. They can just go to different parties at the same time, and on and on and on. You need to allow for God to be able to do a variety of things. God is not one-dimensional like a human being.
Right.
I think we're far afield. Anything more on the...
I think that's the goal.
Yeah.
No, you don't like that. I know. Makes you
anything
nervous.
more on the mysterious figure, and then I want to talk about that Hebrew term, for I've seen God face to face.
Right.
Anything more on the figure?
Well, so one of the things that I think is kind of interesting that happens here and that happens in a few other texts and in Greek myths is this idea that the divine benefactor can suddenly become the divine adversary.
Yes.
So the fact that they're in this, somewhat violent encounter, is also a hallmark of, in particular, the hero, right? So, I mean, everybody loves the hero's journey, which is another reason to love Jacob, because this is part of the testing ground for the hero. So if he can best all of these human beings, that's good, but you're, basically the greater the adversary, the greater the hero. And so with God coming to fight Jacob one-on-one, and Jacob, it's kind of unclear who wins the fight. Maybe it's a draw, I think.
Win is not the right category here.
But he gets a blessing.
Yeah.
But he gets a blessing, which is basically what all of these Greek heroes, Mesopotamian heroes want with this encounter with God. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, are you familiar with that? It's one of the best. If you haven't read it, just go home and read it or listen to it on YouTube or something like that. That's what my son does. He finds it on YouTube and listens that way. But
does
Gilgamesh,
he just tell you that he does that, or does he actually do it as when your mom is?
Oh no,
I was trying to be funny. That was another attempt at humor.
Oh no, I'm with you. I'm trying to be like a little dry with my humor too. Trying to match you. I always say to my husband, if I don't know you're kidding, like, why is that supposed to be funny? So, like, it's funny because you tricked me? I'm not getting it. Anyway, so Gilgamesh has his divine benefactor is Shamash, who is the sun god. And, Shamash is always providing for him and helping him out in the divine council when the other gods want to kill him, because the goddess Ishtar wants to marry him, and Gilgamesh is like, oh no, you're going to kill me if I marry you, so she wants to kill him. Anyway, all of these good relations and protections, just like God with Jacob, until the moment when Shamash decides he wants to fight him. And again, that's another turning point in the narrative for Gilgamesh. This is Menelaus and Proteus, of course. Proteus is the sort of water god, the river god, who Menelaus has to hang on to in order to get an accurate message from, and ultimately gets a sort of report of his blessed afterlife. So, and that story where Moses just met God at the burning bush, and they're walking along to Egypt. It's going to be the whole let my people go thing. And all of a sudden you get God just like wanting to kill him. Yep. So that's in Exodus 4, by the way, in case you haven't encountered that particular story. And no real good explanation for that. I wrote my dissertation on God as enemy in Job. So again, we have the divine benefactor who then seems to attack. Long history, right?
God in Job gives the blessing to Satan to attack Job. Wow.
Yeah. And then after the very end, in the epilogue, Job's life is restored like sevenfold.
Worst part of the book.
I know.
It's hard to trust that ending when.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not worse, but it's hard to trust the ending of Job.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not going to say more because I know.
No, because we've also got to talk about Jonah. Okay, so this term, I've seen God face to face. What's going on here?
Yeah. Well, okay, so tell me what you make of it first. It's more fun that way.
I don't have a lot of thoughts on this one.
You don't have a lot of thoughts on this? Okay. So there's so much to think about here, because sometimes seeing the face of God, and even Jacob alludes to this, right, is very threatening. Other texts, though, seeing the face of God is the most fantastic thing in the world. So you hear this in the Psalms.
Yeah.
I want to go to the temple.
Face, O Lord.
Right. As the deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you. When shall I come and behold the face of God? And translations tend to water this down to the presence of God, which I think is just utterly lame. Because what people want is to see, to lock eyes with the divine. Yeah. But they want to do it in controlled circumstances. Yep. Controlled environment. Yep. Because these gods, as we know from this story and some of the others we've mentioned, encountered in the wild, very unpredictable, very volatile. So the whole thing about the temple is that the architecture and the ritual processes and the space itself It's all designed to have an encounter with God face to face that won't kill you. Because God is apparently a little touchy, doesn't want people sneaking up on him, so the priests have to wear bells on their robes so God's not startled. They put like incense smoke between themselves, the priests do, and the God, so that God won't be like overwhelmed by the coarseness of human features. That's the thinking. So encountering God in the wild is going to have potentially terrifying effects.
And it just really quick aside, you all follow this, I'm sure, but I think it's good to name it. The same thing is true for us. Like we set spaces like cathedrals, particular times of prayer. We're going to pray more undoubtedly when somebody dies, and on, and all of that's wonderful. But sometimes it can be a little frightening to pray in the aisle 7 at King Soopers. But I do think, to a surprising degree, we create places and times in which it's kind of acceptable or normalized to go to God, and we don't quite have the courage to do it in other times and places. And what's that about? But back to this place. Anything more on it? This is your last chance to talk about the story, because from here on, we're gonna talk about sacred place.
Let's do it.
More. You done? You're not done.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good.
So, I have long, and some of you heard me say this, I've long been fascinated by sacred place. And I'm deeply influenced by an Episcopal Anglican theologian who taught at Durham and taught at St. Andrews in Scotland, who's done one of his groundbreaking books is called God and Enchantment of Place, Reclaiming Human Experience. His name is David Brown, and he talks about all kinds of places. He talks about mosques, synagogues, and Gothic architecture. He talks about everything from ballet to Japanese gardens, and on and on and on. It's just a riveting read for about 400 pages. And one of the, to put one of his ideas in a nutshell, he believes that there are particular attributes or qualities of God that are better or more easily experienced in certain places than in others. And this resonates for me. So let me give you a couple of examples quickly, and then I want to see what Amy thinks about this. So, and just forgive me for saying this really quickly, about a week and a half ago, our family was skiing at A Basin. Our son flew home from Atlanta to be with us, flew from Atlanta to be here. And we got to, there's this east wall at A Basin, and you hike straight up it, and then you get to come off of the top, and the easiest entrance at A Basin off the east wall is called, I kid you not, the North Pole. And Evans and I did that, and we didn't die. and it was unbelievable. Like, you're doing this traverse on top of the east wall, and it's just, and you can barely, you're having to concentrate so much. It's not easy. It's not, you're not going to die, especially if you go off of the North Pole. You're going to be fine, especially off the North Pole. So, but it's you got to concentrate so much that you can't talk. Especially when you're with my son, he just wants to, concentrate because he's more focused than I. And you're just like, you feel so small, and then you just want to survive, and it's the most unbelievable thing in the world. And God on top of that mountain just feels like the biggest thing ever, and you just feel like a small, tiny speck in this whole universe. Week before that, or sometime around that, we hosted my best friend from college and his wife and his family, and they stayed with us in our house. And we're sitting around the dining room table just telling stories. And it was 5 of us at one point telling stories. Seth, Deb, Catherine, me, and our daughter Adeline, and Frank, her fiance, 6 of us. And you're just telling these stories, and it goes on and on. You're having a glass of wine or whatever. And like it's the most, like there's nothing like that. It's the polar opposite up there on that mountaintop in transcendence. But like it's a setting in which joy and intimacy, like it's the best thing in the whole world. And there's something about it only being 6 of us around that table, and we know each other so well. And that to me is the divine, is like this intimate companion. Does this resonate?
Totally. Well, so as you were talking, obviously you had your Sinai moment at a basin, because Sinai, of course, is where God is terrifying. You have God appearing out of the mountain with thunder and fire, and the ground is shaking and the horns are blowing, and the people are so scared. They're like, Moses, why don't you go up and talk to God, tell us what he says, and we'll respond. We don't want to see that again, because that was too much. So there's that wild, a sort of super transcendent manifestation of the divine that it sounds like you had some access to.
I really do think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I won't keep going on about it, but yeah.
Well, and then the second moment.
And I'm not trying to compare myself to Moses.
No,
that's
of course
not. Like literally, like there are all kinds of problems with that analogy, but yeah.
Well, but what I appreciate is that you're saying, when I'm out in the world, be it aisle 7 at King Soopers, or at the top of a basin, or at a dinner table, I'm basically kind of wondering where God is. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So,
and I don't have the sense that I get all of God in any one of those places.
Yeah.
I don't think God comes to me and is like, I'm going to reveal fully who I am. It's always a partial. Right.
And only to Richard.
Well, that's where you might get in a little bit of trouble, if I think that I'm special. But I hear you.
Yeah. So it's a matter of, I think, tuning your attention to God's presence. But I was thinking, when you were talking about the dinner table, about the book of Ruth. So God doesn't appear directly in the book of Ruth. So here we've been through Genesis, where God is like popping up all the time, very physically present in the lives of these characters. And in Ruth, God seems to be present in people's actions, but also in acts of feeding and eating. So that partly what's happening in this story is that God's chesed is more of like a vibe, and it's being ingested and shared through the process of sharing food and gleaning and working in the fields together. So Ruth becomes incorporated into the sort of family of Boaz and the family of God. This is her way to survive, because of this hidden presence of God, but very, what do I want to say? Like if God is in food, which I think the story is suggesting God is, in bread, in the baking of bread and the ingesting of bread and the sharing of bread, that says something really quite powerful about how paying attention to that possibility of presence allows kinship structures to transmit that divine.
Where that could resonate for Episcopalians, for Jesuits, for Catholics, all kinds of people. But we say, and this is an old, many centuries old definition of sacraments, and it's in the prayer book: outward and visible signs of inward and spiritual grace. And really what sacraments do, arguably, is attune your attention, your experience to a sacramental universe. Not just a sacramental church, or not just a sacramental altar or a sacramental font.
Yeah.
What do you make of, and I think Christians struggle, I struggle with it sometimes. I just think that we portray Christianity sometimes, the God of Christianity, as having too narrow and short of a list of virtues and attributes. So God is merciful, God is just, God is loving, God raises the dead. But what we're really doing here is like, and David Brown does this again and again, but God is also infinite, God is also mysterious, God is also joyful, God is also a wrestler. Like, is that partly what we're talking about? Is God for God to be, like, there's just a range of attributes.
Yeah.
God's more
Yeah.
interesting than we make God out to be sometimes.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's because we don't read the Hebrew Bible enough.
It could be. And I was wondering if you were going to say that. You just get a greater range of stories in the Hebrew Scriptures. And it's not a competition between Old and New Testament from either direction, but yes. And
Yeah.
Jesus himself knew that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when you said joy, I was thinking about Psalm 104 and the joy that God takes in biodiversity and all of the aspects of creation. Who's that? There's that biologist who talked about God's inordinate fondness for beetles. I guess there are like 400,000 species of beetles.
So we're gonna rearrange our order just a bit. No. We're gonna end with Jonah and that image.
Oh, right. Yes.
So one of the questions I've got for Amy that we talked about a couple weeks ago, she and I did, is thinking through, and this is a passion of hers, environmental ethics, stewardship of creation, whatever you call it. But Amy, if God is revealed in a variety of ways in a variety of places, in an era of whatever you want to call it, environmental degradation, climate change, whatever the term is, but is the world, as the physical world becomes impoverished, as we have less, as climate change affects places, will it limit? Not only is it terrible ethically and morally, it's bad theologically. Because it limits the range of experiences of divine. Yes.
So I have a couple thoughts on that. The first is to tie back to last week when we were talking about Babel, the Tower of Babel story, and that being, I think, an etiology for the diversity of human culture and human language.
Yes.
And that God is often depicted as a God who just likes diversity, lots of it. And you can see it in that story there. And then, again, I was looking at Psalm 104, and I was thinking about the God speeches in the book of Job. And God is also really committed to and interested in biodiversity. So in the God speeches in the book of Job, are you all familiar with those?
Yes, 38, chapter 38. God speaks, and I'm not trying to impress the professor, but chapter 38, everybody's been talking Job's ear off. It's awful. All of his friends are giving him advice. It's terrible. They're explaining why he's suffering. And then finally, in chapter 38, God speaks out of a whirlwind. It's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. Some people are pissed because we know what happened in the prologue, right? Which is that God basically placed a bet with the Satan to see if Job was truly faithful, and said, the way we're going to, figure out who wins this bet is to torment Job by killing his children and taking away his house and everything like that. And so Job is understandably upset, right? Asking, why is this happening to me? And God basically comes in the whirlwind and arguably changes the subject by talking about creation.
Yeah.
But the point, I think, of the speeches, if you're really thinking about how the poetry works, is that God is saying, look at the world, look at the diversity in the world. And this chapter, so there's 38 where, they're kind of running around the cosmos together, and God's like, look at that. And did you do that? No, you didn't, so shut up. And look at that, and look at that. And then in 39, they're looking at all these wild animals. And all of it, they're like kooky ones, like the ostrich, and I can't remember what other animals right off the top of my head, but it's a celebration of animals that basically have no utility for human beings. So just the fact that the ostrich is silly looking makes God laugh, and so that's a good thing. And the fact that the behemoth is stronger than any other creature in the world, and the Leviathan is similar, means that these are the creatures created in the image of God here. So it's sort of a what would I say, like a rejoinder to Genesis 1, human beings being created in the image of God, and God's like, no, actually, it's Leviathan.
Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? We as human beings are just one small part of all that variety.
Yeah, and so I think when we think about environmental justice, maintaining that diverse universe not only theologically gives us access to this incredibly diverse, multivalent, ever mysterious God, but also enacts kind of God's values there and saying, well, it may not be of particular use to us, and yet look at this universe populated with all of these different life forms. That should be preserved in and of itself. But the other thing I thought about, and this has to do partly with the sacramental view of the world, is ritual, which I know you Episcopalians are kind of into, yeah?
A little bit.
It's kind of a thing. But because
our heart's in it too, Amy. We're like, it's not just a dry ritual.
When I was in seminary, so I went to a Presbyterian seminary, we all had a phase where we wanted to be Episcopalian because we're like, they have got it going on. That is totally the way to go. Because we suddenly learned the value of liturgy and ritual in school and then saw it playing out in this beautiful way. Anyway, to find ways, I think, not just in church, though definitely in church, to incorporate ritual into our seeing. Because a lot of what we're dealing with, I think now, forgive me for, kind of off the cuff here, things I don't know that much about, but I would say our attention is partly the problem. I mean, we're just divided and distracted and crazy this way. And so focusing on aspects of creation where God's wisdom comes through, where God's joy comes through, where grief even manifests, ritually marking those things in some way and bringing that power of ritual to focus our attention, I think is a way to kind of push back against some of this.
If you want a book suggestion, I mean, what Amy is talking about is what all of Annie Dillard's almost every book is about. Try Holy the Firm. She won a Pulitzer Prize for Pilgrim to Tinker Creek. She spends most of her time in Catholic churches. Every now and then she'll go to an Episcopal church, but it's about exactly that. She's grounded in the liturgy, but it opens her mind and heart to all kinds of particular places the world over, and in the human heart. I mean, Holy the Firm's narrative is about a child suffering from a fire, for example. So absolutely. So can we talk about Jonah really quickly? This is where you rightly get so nervous when I just do a nod to something, but this is what we're going to end with, even if Amy's nervous. So again, I told you that Amy's commentary on the book of Jonah is just marvelous. We were in a Bible study on Wednesday for Lent. The reading that we just did a nod to was Jonah, and I shared with the class, it was about 60 people. I said, let me tell you what Amy Erickson says about Jonah being angry at God at basically the end of the book. And this is what Amy writes in this commentary, this very academic commentary, which is salt and peppered with all these wonderful lines and humor and art and music. She says that God, speaking to Jonah in the tone of a Rogerian therapist, says, Jonah, is it good for you to be angry? And the whole class laughed, just like you did. I mean, it's just this thing is just beautiful. And even if you don't want to read it, get it for a coffee table book, because it's also beautiful. It's also beautiful. So I highly suggest it. But what Amy does that relates in a way to what we're talking about, on page 120, and I gave it to you in the back of the story, is she's got, this is just such a great page. And she talks about music related to Jonah and all of this. But she gives us this picture of a whale memorial on the bottom. Now up above that in the second paragraph, she tells us that there are at least 3 Jonah-inspired sculptures in Israel. Where else are you going to learn that except for Amy's book? And who else cares about things like that except for Amy?
Right, that's true.
But there are 3 sculptures, and then look at this sculpture. That's unbelievable. That's unbelievable. And what? So Amy, just have fun with this one, and we'll end with it. What happens? Not so much to Jonah. What happens to us? What happens in the belly of a whale? Yeah. That's a particular place, unlike dining room tables and unlike mountaintops.
Yeah. Okay, let me see how I can do this quickly. So I was reading, of course, the Jacob story, and I was hearing so many resonances between that story and the belly of the whale story / poem. Because I think what you get there in the imagery, as well as in the narrative, is Jonah on this knife edge of life and death.
Yeah.
And again, I'm going to try to do this quickly, but the resonances with Northwest Semitic poetry and mythology make it so that this creature, who seems like, just a somewhat docile fish, although human swallowing, so maybe
Catherine
not so
loves whales.
docile.
My wife loves whales. She's seen them in California. She's seen them in Hawaii.
They're extraordinary creatures, aren't
yeah.
they? Yeah. So, but for the, in the world of the ancient Near East, you got to be hearing in the background, in your mind, the stories of Yam and the Leviathan and the sea creature who tends to function as an adversary of God's. You also have, in the action of swallowing Jonah, you have the deity, this again, all known from the ancient Near Eastern world, whose name is Mot, death, who swallows human beings. They have these like really kind of graphic passages describing Mot's mouth and how he takes people into his gullet and down into his belly, never to return. So you have this sense that Jonah is definitely going to die in this fish belly. But what happens there is that as he kind of goes down poetically and speaks in this poetic language of a psalm, he finds himself at the gates of the netherworld. He finds himself about to be closed in the land of the dead. And then God brings him up. And he makes his way to the temple, his prayer does, to the temple to encounter the face of God. And then he's kind of weirdly resurrected out of this belly. But the whole time in this poem, and even in the language of the belly of the fish, which morphs to become the womb of the fish, you don't know if he's going to experience a rebirth, a transformation because of this encounter with death, or if he's actually going to die. And so it turns out that he's resurrected and kind of transformed in that Jonah style, which is transformed, really, we don't really know. It's kind of a parody of the whole thing. Seems not to come out like a better man the way Jacob does, but that all of those gestures toward darkness and going inward and the dark night of the soul, which again, St. John of the Cross sees the dark night of the soul in the fish belly, they all resonate also with Christian understandings of baptism. Yeah. So you go into the water, you die, and you come out, you put your white robes on, and you are a transformed person. But as with Jonah, we know it's not a one and done, right? You come out with your white robes, and then, you go out in the parking lot, get in your car, and you're covered in mud. Yeah. And you got to start all over again. Those are my thoughts about the whale belly.
I think what we're going to do is this. It's 10:15. Amy, I think you would kindly stay just for a few minutes so people have individual questions.
Of course, always, yep.
So come up to Amy after this class. And then I just ask that you thank her warmly with applause, because we want her to come back, don't we?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, just Amy, thank you profoundly. And I'll say this not as a kind of summary, but I think one of your many gifts to us these past 2 weeks has been these stories that we hear in church, that we read from the scriptures, are, we should feel them and kind of paradoxically. They're not our stories in one sense. There's a whole history and a lineage and an echo of other stories. These stories, like the story of Moses, began their life as the story of real people with their own real struggles that are not exactly ours sometimes. And as we wrestle with the particularity of a history and those details, what is also true is that these are our stories. They have profound resonance with what you and I go through in our own day and times. And I think you've just opened that up thoughtfully and imaginatively. And for that, we are profoundly grateful. Will you come back one day again, please?
Absolutely.
Okay,
if we can do this like this.
yeah,
This is so much more
Amy
fun than
likes
just
the Q&A,
lecturing, right?
the dialogue
Yeah.
piece more than the lecture piece. And I enjoy that. So absolutely, we'll have you back again. Thanks just so much. If you got a question for Amy, just come up and see her before you go. For those joining us online, come back for Holy Eucharist at 10:30 a.m. at the same place, sjcathedral.org. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.